just a few words of what we're trying to do with this series. We're trying to take the idea of liberation permaculture, which is trying to extend permaculture into more of a social justice framework, and start thinking about our own community in context of all these different axes by which power exists in our world, right? So this first session is a little different than what we plan future sessions to be like. We plan to have more conversational type things. This one, we really want some of the theory groundwork for the idea of liberation permaculture before we start diving into those other areas. So just an explanation for what we're doing and why we're doing it. I'm very aware that this is very unusual for Sangaya. We don't typically have presentations, we typically have conversations. But there's certain circumstances where having an intellectual framework to start off with actually can be kind of helpful. So what I'm about to talk about, talking about social justice and intersectionality, is inherently emotionally laden and controversial. I have opinions on this, just like anybody here does. You will probably find that some of the things I say you don't agree with, and that's actually entirely okay. So bear with me. What I will say is I will be talking fast as I'm going through this. It's sort of doing a TED Talk style. But afterwards, I do want us to have a chance to talk about this. So for those who would like, I'm going to be having drinks at my house afterwards. And both alcoholic and non-alcoholic. So come by if you'd like, and you can talk about it to your heart's delight, you know. So also, you know, if you get bored, you can leave. It's okay. I won't be offended. All right. So, how am I in the frame, generally speaking? Yeah. All right. Cool. So, well, I already kind of introduced this. So, social justice and intersectionality. That's a goal of this talk. Social justice is really one of the key frameworks for liberation permaculture, and then intersectionality is sort of a way that we're increasingly thinking about the way to be activists in the world, right? There has been a shift in terms of how we talk about activism, how we think about identity politics, and this is a controversial shift. For the purposes of this talk and for this series, we're going to be taking an intersectional lens, or we're going to be trying to, and that's a challenging shift in terms of how to think about things. So I want to just give some sort of framework and background for that. And as you all know, permaculture actually isn't really my thing, but what I am hoping to do is really piece out the idea that most of these political efforts that are really trying to push forward with liberation permaculture are really taking social justice as a foundational framework. So this is a Beehive collective. They have done all this amazing work around sort of connecting ideas around permaculture with art and with social justice frameworks and thinking about colonialism and imbalances of power. And if you ever get a chance to see them talk about that, it's really amazing. But what I'm trying to do is sort of build that connection a little bit. Oops. All right. So well, if I had an overview slide. So what I will be doing in this talk is I'm going to be starting off talking a little bit about comparing two different farms, two different agricultural systems. Then I'm going to talk just briefly about sort of history of social justice and social justice frameworks. Then I'm going to talk about our community and talk about our actual location. I'm going to show you lots of maps about the data about where we live and what that looks like in terms of social justice. Then I'm going to go and talk about actually about identity politics, which is sort of the way that we, our tradition for thinking about how to enact social justice. A very rich tradition, but one that has certain challenges. And then I'll talk about the transition into intersectionality and that way of thinking about things. All right, so first farm that I'm going to talk about. You may have heard of it. It's this little place called Sangaya. So it is a community-based garden or farm, as you choose to view it, where we work together to produce food. And that is really an emotional center for our community. You'll see, as we depict ourselves, very often if you talk to people, the garden will always come up as something that we identify with, right? And in many ways, especially during the summer, that's sort of an emotional center of our community. We do a lot with it. You know, we produce, as you know, about, you know, in the area of 5,000 pounds of fruits and vegetables per year, which is a lot. You know, that's something that we, for a lot of the year, we provide, you know, as much as maybe 50% of our food that we eat. So we use permaculture methods. We take that very seriously. We experiment with that. It's something that we're very interested in being innovative around. We're clearly very proud of that, and we should be. So in this context of having a strong community, there's some things that we should note about that have allowed us to do. I think one of the major triumphs that we've had recently is that we've done what very few people can do, which is that we actually took on a developer. A developer moved in next door, and we were actually able to gather money together to create a legal challenge. We spent a lot of money to do that, about $91,000, right? But we did protect land in between that margin, right? That gives us a food forest, right? We also actually were able to change the Homish County Code. So we are actually able to change politics in part because of our ability to be politically active, right? So that is an important thing to note about who we are and what we can do. So one of the things I just want to point out is that farm number 1 that I just mentioned, it's an exception. This is a very unusual sort of situation for producing food. When you look at overall farms, actually, it turns out that in terms of numbers, a lot of these farms are actually small family farms. But when it comes to actual production of food, it's usually these large-scale family farms or commercial farms that produce most of the food in our society. Another way to view this is to look at organic foods. Now, I know that organic foods are not the same as permaculture, right? But it does produce some sort of schema for looking at this. The data here is a little hard to sort of get exactly, but organic food make up about 4% of food sales in the United States. So a fairly, a growing margin component of food sales, but still a smaller portion of that overall. When you look at the customers for that food, you'll find that it's primarily white, about 73%, and tends to be higher income communities, okay? Another way to look at this in terms of seeing how unusual this is to look at sales that happen through direct sales. So we often think about farmers markets, or we think about farm stands or farm stores, right, as another way of thinking about maybe permaculture or locally produced food. Well, when we look at that, there was about $3 billion of sales last year, in 2016, for those farmers markets and farm sales. But if you look at that compared to overall grocery sales, it's only about 0.1% of overall grocery sales. So again, we're talking a fairly small margin if we're looking at what this type of local permacultural production of food is in our world. We all know that when we look at these things, these ideas of organic foods or permaculture, that there is a margin that of money that you can get for producing organic food. So a lot of corporations have found, as you all know, that they can actually make more money if they market things as being organic. So we have, they can make more money because you have sometimes fairly substantial increases in cost for items, and often for corporations, a few cents actually turns into millions of dollars for them, right? So what we do see is overall when we talk about organics and the way that organics is used, that we have these corporations that are dominating the production of foods in those situations. So. Yeah.
Just might point out that these are retail prices in January, and that because most organic stuff is. Excuse me?
2014.
Yeah. Right, but what I'm saying is that they're January prices, and that in general, produce prices are higher in the winter, and even more higher for organic because they're smaller farms and they tend to have seasonal local foods available. So like spinach in January, it's kind of a even though that has relatively less of a difference, but in terms of what you're looking at, for example, if you were taking like July numbers or August numbers, I'm guessing that the spread would be really different because there's more local organic food available, and so the price difference is going to be less.
Right. And you know, when I looked at this, I did see different estimates for that, but I think it was fairly consistent that the organic foods were more expensive.
They are more expensive.
So,
I'm just saying that the fact that
and
it's
that doesn't mean that
January
you shouldn't
season-
buy them. I'm just saying
Yeah.
that there is a
Right.
economic, there's an economic
There's more
gain to
difference at
be,
different times of
yeah.
the year, is the only thing I'm trying to say, which I happen
Sure.
to know.
Yeah.
And that January is one of the times when it's more exaggerated.
Cool. So in this context of this type of situation, what I want to talk about is if we're going to view food systems, I think it's also important to turn our attention to what a more typical form of food production might be. All right. So I'm going to talk to you about the Sakuma Brothers farm.
I just have a quick question.
Yeah.
Can you go back to the picture?
Yeah.
Will you just say something about that?
This is actually large, like General Mills, Cargill, Kellogg, and how they've actually taken over what we see of the organic brands that are out there
Oh,
available. So that's what that's showing.
Who owns what?
Who owns what, right? So the thing is that many of the things that we see as being organic and being, you know, small farm type things are actually fully corporate, right? I'm going to talk a little bit about the Sakuma Brothers farm. So Sakuma Brothers farm is actually a farm that is organic and conventional. So it's a mix of the two. They've added in organic because there's actually a profit to be made in organics. I'll talk about that a little bit more. So the Sakuma Brothers farm is about 50 miles north of here, so it's actually a local farm. We actually know a fair bit about this farm because what is fairly unusual is they actually let an anthropologist come into their farm and actually study their farm systems, particularly in the context of undocumented and immigrant labor. All right. So this book is called Fresh Fruit, Broken Bodies by Seth Holmes, who's a friend of a colleague of mine. And this is actually a very well-respected book. It won a lot of honors for what it did, and it actually it was picked as the UW Book of the Year for a period of time. But the goal of this was essentially to talk a little bit about what that conventional food production system actually looks like. So here is the way that the farm laborers put together. So as compared to Sangaya, where we do have a garden manager, but the garden manager sort of gently suggests that maybe we do certain things, but we more or less do what we want when we want to, among the people who are passionate to pursue that. That's not how it works at the Sakuma Brothers farm. They have this anthropologist interviewed across all the different hierarchies. As you go from the top levels to the bottom levels of this hierarchy, you'll not be surprised to know that there's a change in terms of money, control, power of your life, what you do, right, and the health impact of what you do on that farm. So the farm executives, actually the Sakuma brothers, are kind of notable in the sense that they let this anthropologist come in. Secondly, that they actually do care about social justice. They are a Japanese family, and they came in as immigrants as well, and they care about this type of question, right? But they are facing a really challenging global situation where in order to keep their family farm going, and they want to do that, they actually need to have relatively cheap labor, right? So your hourly wage in Washington State is about $7.15. But in California, it's about $5, right? So they have to actually figure out a way that they can produce their food and sell their food and still compete with California. Then they also have to compete with the places like Chile. In Chile, they might pay $7.15 per day for workers there, right? So it's a global marketplace, and in order to turn a profit, they have to be very competitive, right? So that is their argument for what's going on in the situation, and they, these leaders would argue, they provide an opportunity for people to make money and build a new life for themselves, right? Under the farm executives, you have crop managers. Those are the ones who sort of oversee the production of food across different parts of the farm. And then you have the supervisors who are directly supervising the hourly field workers and contract field workers. Hourly field workers are usually documented immigrants from Mexico. And they tend to work in the organic farm component to this. They tend to have better pay, and they also have more security. They also have typically less painful labor that they do. So they'll be doing more of the standing up labor, for example. We also have the checkers. The checkers are the ones who oversee directly the food produced by the field workers who are called contract field workers. The checkers will examine the fruits to see whether or not they've been picked properly. They'll put it back to the worker if they see too many stems in there, or if it seems to have too many rotten things in it, right? So they oversee it. There is actually, I will just say, there's a ton of conflict between the contract workers and the checkers because of substantial racism in that relationship. So what does it, when we're talking about the contract field workers, who are they and what are they doing? So the contract workers are typically undocumented immigrants who come to the U.S. from Mexico. So when they're picking, they get paid about 14 cents per pound of strawberries that they pick. All right. So the interesting thing is that in order, by law, AKUMA Brothers has to pay them minimum wage, right? So they have to pick enough strawberries in order to actually justify paying minimum wage. What that actually turns out is you have to pick 51 pounds of strawberries per hour to make that minimum wage. All right. So 51 pounds of strawberries per hour is an incredibly difficult thing to do. So if you fail to meet that minimum twice, you get fired, right? And if you get fired, you lose your housing. You're currently living in the camp. Now, the camps that they live in are really substandard and cold and challenging living conditions, but there's a place to live. So, so in that context, when they work, what they very often do is they start at 5 a.m. Many of them actually don't drink water or eat any food before their shift so that they can actually make it through that shift and pick that 51 pounds. Because if you stop to use the bathroom, you actually might not make your quota for that day. So it's incredibly difficult work where they pick with both hands and just go for it. Of course, you're also spending the whole day bent over, moving through the fields. All right. As I mentioned before, there's a lot of discussion around the racism that they experience from both the checkers and supervisors, and there's some really interesting documentation around what that looks like in that book and the types of relationships. There's a lot of racism around the idea that Mexican people are shorter, therefore they're closer to the ground, so it has less of an impact on them, for example, right? Those types of ideas, right? There's other sort of interesting factors, like this is, as I mentioned, an organic farm, but by organic code, you actually have to use machines to pick in the organic farm. So the people who are most in contact with the pesticides and the impactful things are the workers who are doing this, whereas the organic farms actually get picked by these machines, right? So machines doesn't matter if they interact with the pesticides. So it's one of those ironies of sort of the way that we do these systems.
Can you clarify, in order for software organic, it has to be picked by machine?
In that case, yeah. So for organics, they spray with vinegar instead of pesticides. It would be something that would be preferable for you to be interacting with. So when it comes to health impacts of this, they are substantial. So they've documented how it results in major arthritis, joint pains, back problems. As you can imagine, being bent over every day working like that. You also have the exposure to pesticides and the respiratory problems and the potential reproductive problems, the stress and mental health problems, a lot of substance abuse that might come with that, although less than typical population because of the cost of that. There is really substantial health impacts that happen. What's interesting is actually we don't bear the cost of those health impacts because they go back to Mexico, and the health system in Mexico pays for those types of health impacts. So another global health impact. The other thing I would just like to note about this is that we often think about this as unskilled labor. And what I will point out is that to pick 51 pounds of strawberries per hour is ridiculously superhumanly skilled labor. The anthropologist Seth Holmes, who did this work, he describes, one, how he worked with them only twice per week, right, for about 3 years, right? But he describes how he still has gastric problems, knee problems, and back problems just from those 3 years, right? He has been dramatically impacted from that. He also says, which I think is notable, is that despite trying as hard as he possibly could all of those 3 years, he never once picked the minimum. He never once was able to meet that minimum to meet minimum wage. So the point here being that this is incredibly skilled labor to do this, and typically unrewarded. The good news is that they actually have unionized, and there is some interesting motion in terms of them getting a better contract, one of the better contracts in Washington State. But what I will note is that that isn't, even in that context, we're still talking about not very good situation, right? And we're talking about this, what I just described there in terms of the situation that exists, that's actually sort of typical of our agricultural system. So according to the book, about 95% of agricultural workers were born in Mexico. About 52% are undocumented, which numbers vary in terms of how many people that actually ends up being. But when you add up, that 14 cents per pound, that actually doesn't add up to a lot at minimum wage. So it's about $3,000 to $5,000 per year. And you still have to pay the coyote to get across the border, and the cost of living. So there is we're not talking about a lot of money that you're making over the course of a year. Very tight margins to live in that situation. So what do we make of this and this comparison between two different farms? Well, first off, you'll probably say you're comparing apples and oranges, and I am. These are two very different things, and it might be annoying that I'm making this comparison. But I do think that there is a conversation to be had about the relationship between these two different things. And I have opinions about that, and you all probably have opinions about that. What I think doesn't necessarily matter that much, but what I would like to encourage us to do is to think about what is the relationship between these two different situations that I described. One of the things that I connect this into is the idea of social justice. If you are concerned about what I just described to you, and I'm sure we all are, this is probably because you're kind of thinking this is not fair. This is not a just system in any way, shape, or form, right? So when we're talking about social justice, this is a term that kind of is used very broadly. So it's kind of, in some ways, almost means good things, right? Generally speaking, I've seen people who've tried to break out the many different meanings of social justice. For the purpose of this, I'm just going to be using a broad definition in terms of justice or fairness in terms of how we distribute goods of society, wealth, opportunities, and privileges. Okay, so that's what we're talking about in terms of social justice. Now, I actually really wanted to talk a fair bit about the history of social justice. I don't have time, which is sad. But we have a tremendous history of thinking about social justice and those issues in both our religions and ethical frameworks around the globe. That this is the idea of reciprocity, the idea of fairness is something that we've had in human society since its beginning, right? It also has had this amazing evolution in social movements from early research that originally showed in France that if you look at arrondissements, how do you call the different regions of Paris? Thank you. That if you correlate income with age of death, well, what do you find? Well, there's this correlation. You also have increasing pressure from ethical frameworks that talk about the need to think about disparities across populations. And we see that through the hygiene movement in the United States. And we see that through the civil rights movement and all these different evolution in our societies to push for this idea of social justice. It's very much a key component to how we consider things in the United States. Yeah.
I have a social security question. So I have known for a while that poor people die younger, right?
Yeah.
The age at which you can take social security out is set. It's set differently for many women, but it's not set differently for poor versus wealthy. And so I am kind of curious because they do get out of it what you put in, and there's an average, and I wonder. And I guess the one thing that provides a backup is Social Security also is disability income. So maybe if you're poor, you get what you put in, but it's because you become disabled first and they get old second. So I'm curious if poor people are putting in more and getting less proportionally out of Social Security than the wealthy people who don't actually necessarily need it. Does that make sense? Like a lot of people have plenty of money, they can still get your Social Security check, but you live forever.
That sounds about right to me. I don't actually know the numbers on that. So that sounds like there is a sort of justice issue or a question here. Is that fair? How effective is that as a distribution? We do know that Social Security makes a huge difference for overall well-being. So I would certainly not argue that that's a bad thing to have happen, but there might be questions around fairness in terms of, are you getting the same amount out? And I'll actually come back to that in terms of age of death. So just in terms of the philosophy of social justice, I just want to quickly mention a couple ideas. The main person who is credited as a philosopher for sort of rejuvenating the idea of social justice and justice theories, John Rawls, who wrote in the middle of the 1900s and into the 80s. And he really talked about how social justice is, and articulated how it is an ethical responsibility for all of us in terms of our obligations to one another. But what he does is he essentially describes a thought experiment, and this is what the thought experiment is. He imagines that we're all sitting in a room, and we have to come together to decide what kind of society are we going to create. And everybody in that room doesn't know what role they're going to be filling in that society. They don't know whether they're going to be the farmer or the executive or the person with a disability. You don't know. You could be any of those things. And so his question was, in that context, what kind of society would we create, right? And essentially his answer is, we wouldn't create a society where the wealthy, one or two people holds all the wealth. There's no way we do that, because our chances are, our probability is that we're going to not be that person, right? So we would think of a society that would be much more justly distributed. Maybe some differences, but that would not be the society. This unequal society would not be what we create. The second point that he makes with this, which I think is also really important for how we think about our decisions, is that another principle that he imagines coming out of that conversation was that when we make actions, when we do things, that we would make decisions such that we would produce the greatest benefit for the people who are worst off, right? So when we make decisions, we're not making decisions so that we benefit the people who are already benefiting. We make decisions and make sure that we're benefiting the people who have the least power or in that society. And the idea here is that if we do that, we're going to have this constant onward spiral where we keep on bringing people up and up and up, right? So that's something to consider in terms of how we approach these types of social justice issues. Now, this seems obvious, but I would say that this idea around social justice is not necessarily uniformly held. Historically we had Calvinism, but the ideas of Calvinism still hold true for some people, and the idea that your wealth is a symbol of your moral or spiritual worth, right? We also have the idea of social Darwinism, which is the idea of the survival of the fittest, right? That the more wealth you can gather, you get it because you deserve it, and that's part of the biological imperative, and that we should just go ahead and do this. And we see that at the highest levels of our government, where Trump said essentially, I'm smart, I don't pay taxes, in terms of distributing that wealth in society, right? So this is very much a conversation that is not a clear assumption that people would just necessarily believe in social justice perspectives on how we make decisions. One of the primary criteria for thinking about social justice is actually income. All right, so it's not everything, but it is a major consideration. So I like showing this slide because it's a pretty pivotal study that was done. I think this is in 2011, but this has actually been repeated, where they did a nationwide sample to look at how people think about income disparities. And in this case, it's actually not income, it's actually wealth. And wealth is actually probably a better depictor of what people have than their income, because it's sort of your accumulated wealth that you have. So when they ask people what the ideal breakdown of wealth across the top 20% down to the bottom 20% is, you'll see a chart that looks like this. What's interesting is that they looked across, political affiliation, Republicans versus Democrats. They looked across men, women. They also looked across different income levels, and you see some slight differences across those different categories, but that we normally think of as being important for how people think about it. But the interesting thing is that the way that Republicans think about this and Democrats think about this and high-income people think about this and low-income people think about this, they're really very close, all right? So this really is a pretty good representation of how Americans think about how this should be. Now this picture here is actually more egalitarian than our most egalitarian societies in the world, say Sweden, for example. Yeah?
Can you explain what the is showing?
Yeah, so this is the top 20%. The top 20% in this sort of ideal owns about 30% of the overall wealth. The next 20% owns about another 20%, and the next owns about 20%. This owns maybe 10, 15%. and the bottom 20% owns about 10%. Okay. Now, they then ask them, how much do they actually, how do they think this actually looks in our society, in the United States? What do they estimate our wealth distribution is in our society? And what you find is that they actually do recognize that our top 20% owns a lot of our wealth. So they estimate about almost 60% of the wealth, then down to about 20%, et cetera. So they recognize that we live in an unequal society. But then you look at the top one, which is the actual distribution of wealth in our society. And the actual distribution of wealth is actually massively more unequal than even our recognition in terms of our estimates. So here, the top 20% owns about 85% of our wealth. The bottom fourth and bottom 20% disappears off the chart because it's so low. All right. So what I use this to show is that our understanding of social justice, our understanding of just how bad inequality is in our society, tends to be grossly an underestimate of just how unequal we are. Okay. Yeah.
Another thing that doesn't happen is the damage you can do to our economy when you get things too unbalanced.
Yep.
Can actually cause the whole system to break down.
There's like massive potential implications of what we have here, and the lack of recognition of the distinction between what we have here is a huge issue.
Just a quick thing too to support that sort of buttressing. The studies of healthcare and health condition, the health of the populace, show that in more egalitarian societies, relatively egalitarian, even the wealthy in those societies are healthier than the wealthy in unequalitarian.
That's interesting. Yeah. So
20 years ago when I went to school, they had an interesting bit of information. I don't know if it's still true. There's a little bit of social mobility simply because wealthier people have fewer children. So those top spots, so there's a little bit of social mobility because you do creep up to the bottom just because the richest people are reproduced themselves in terms of, and I don't know if that's in terms of money or just in terms of class, but it was interesting. And I don't know if that is still true or even was true then, but it was interesting.
There's a lot of research on this, and we do have some social mobility, but they actually have done indices of this.
Yeah.
We're actually much worse than comparable industrial countries, like where the metrics are. I think we're about the likelihood of changing class. I think is about half of what Great Britain, for example, has. So even though we think of ourselves as having a lot of mobility in the United States, we actually don't. When we think about the impact of this great inequality, I think it's important to note that income is really associated with very important health and social incomes. And one of the most important things is how long you live. So this is just a chart showing the relationship between income and life expectancy. And what you see is that there's a very clear relationship. As income goes up, life expectancy goes up. For this talk, I'm primarily talking about the United States. But it's important to recognize that we have some countries in the world that the average life span is in the upper 40s to about 50, right? In other countries, we're talking about the mid 80s, right? So we're talking about a difference of about 30 years, right? So there is a huge difference globally in terms of how long you can actually live, and that's really closely tied into this income distribution. So I just talked about sort of big picture ideas around social justice. Well, let's talk about us. Let's talk about right here, what's happening in our communities. So I'll be focusing primarily on health as an outcome because I do public health and that's my interest. But I think that some of these other things will be illustrative and useful for us to think about. So let me first talk about Snohomish County. I will say before I even start, we're also close to King County. Almost everything I say is pretty much identical for King County in terms of inequality. So for Sonoma County, the average income is about $68,000. This is 2013 data, which is the most recent I could find. But if you look across the different regions of Snohomish County, we have a huge disparity in terms of average income. So we go from Mill Creek, where the average family income is about $100,000, to North Everett, where it's about $55,000. So we see almost double the income in certain parts of our community. Now, we know that income correlates with life expectancy, as I mentioned. This lower chart is life expectancy. So in our community, we have Bothell, which actually has the highest average life expectancy for our region. The average lifespan is about 82.7, okay? Now, within our community, the lowest is in the Tulare Bay and North Coast area with a 73.3. So we see approximately a 10-year difference in lifespan within our direct region. Now, 10 years, I don't know how much you would pay or give or want an additional 10 years of life. But we're saying that on average, just because of where you live, we have a difference in 10 years of life. That's huge, right? That's a huge difference in our own communities and really quite notable and something that we should think about in terms of what explains these types of differences in what we're facing. So when we think about regional demographics, you can also think about other factors that are associated with income and health, right? So in our region, we're about 72% white. What's notable is that we are we have a high representation of Asian people of Asian descent, and then smaller numbers of other communities here, lower Hispanic and Latino and African American than other parts of Snohomish County. So here's what's called a dot map, looking at 2010 census data. So each dot represents one person, okay? And the dot represents white, black, Asian American is red, yellow is Hispanic. And I use this type of data pretty often, and I'll say, actually, when we look at divisions, we're actually doing better than a lot of areas. So in terms of segregation, there's some parts of the city, like especially if you look in South Seattle, you can look at a road and you can see race differs between one side of the road and the other, right? So there's some areas where segregation is much more striking. But you do see differences. Unfortunately, the colors aren't coming up terribly well here. But you do see that there's some differences in terms of where different communities live. And you can actually pair up these areas of diversity shortly with when we start looking at income and other things like that. So you'll see much more diversity along this corridor here. This is looking at our direct area. So this is 228th Street. This is blue dot is where we are. You'll notice that we're actually in a pocket of people who are of Asian descent. So we're actually a minority, perhaps in our own very direct regional community. This is 228th. I think this is 39th here. I think it's right about here. Yeah. So so this is where we live. What's notable about this, and something for us to note, is we actually live in a very diverse area. We might, looking at our own crowd, we may not be as diverse as the area that we actually live in, and that's something to be notable to think about in terms of how we reach out and interact with others. Especially as we're thinking about the idea that we have new neighbors that are right next to us, right? So let's look now at the geographic distribution of people who are living in poverty. And this is at people less than or equal to 85% of the poverty level. So in Bothell, in our area here, we're doing quite well. Here on the side, I'll have the actual numbers for us versus what I'll be categorizing as the worst for this area in this map. And here along this chart is the color ranking. So 10 is high, blue is typically low, all right? Low for whatever the metric is. So I'm going to show a few different things. So here we're talking about low poverty levels, okay? And here is sort of the chart that we look at the difference. So again, one of the things that we care about in social justice is what is the disparity? So the difference between a world where there's, even if you have a certain average, the difference between a world where there's a huge disparity, disparities always tend to associate with factors of marginalization, right? So if you have big disparities, it's usually the people who are marginalized who have something, health status or whatever, that's very different than the people at the top, right? So it's always our interest to try and bring us towards a more egalitarian society, or that's the idea of social justice. Yes?
It's basically my imagination, but it looks to me like a lot of red and orange follows I-5. Is that?
That's actually Aurora.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. So I-5 is right here. I-5 is right here, and this I think is Aurora Highway. So we see. Notice this. I mean, you'll see this. Notice this because you will see this in all the remaining maps, pretty much. All right. So this distribution looks fairly similar, and what we're seeing is essentially the health disparity and the disparities of our community. And also Monroe is also notable as well. Sorry.
It looks like that followed the previous map, the line of.
Yep, that's what I was also mentioning in terms of diversity. Again, you see a similar diversity cluster along that region. Okay. All right, so this is percent of the population living in poverty. Buffalo's doing quite well. We're at about 8%, compared to worst or the highest rate of poverty, which is 55% in certain areas. When we look at household income by race, we see some differences. I will say, actually, when we look at differences, we're actually doing much better than other areas that I've looked at in my work. For example, I was just looking at data from Memphis, and African-American families in Memphis have half the income of white families in Memphis, right? Whereas we see a closer distribution along this data. But this is actually the data for Snohomish County. So that gives us some idea of sort of the fact that we do have differences across racial categories. Now, when we look at high school diploma, another indication of privilege, we see a similar sort of distribution to what we talked about previously, especially in terms of rural communities. And when we look at lower life expectancy, we again see this sort of geographic distribution as well. Right? When we look at no health insurance, again, no health insurance is a major predictor of how long you're likely to live. Same sort of thing. So we're looking at 5% for Bothell of people who don't have health insurance, compared to about 33% in other areas. Okay. When we look at health status, you won't be surprised that people report fair or poor health, which is a very good indicator of your likelihood of having disability or having a lower decreased lifespan. Well, it varies substantially across whether or not your educational level, so from 46% up to college age, college prepared, where you have about 7%, right? Huge disparities there. And also by average income. Right? When we look at people with disabilities, same chart, same sort of distribution as well. And when we look at health status across looking at people who state that they could not see a doctor because of cost, as we look across education, we see a similar trajectory. Income, we see a similar trajectory. When we look across race, we see particularly Hispanic populations who have a much higher risk in terms of not being able to access healthcare. Okay. We also have, when we look at our communities, another indicator of access is limited English proficiency. And something interesting here is that we actually have about 10% in our region who have limited English proficiency, and Brentford probably has something to say to us about that. So there is opportunities to do outreach in that respect. But again, we see a fairly similar sort of distribution in many ways. And a major predictor of health is also housing. And we know that housing is a big issue for our region, especially given how expensive things are around here. You look, and if you look at the percent of income spent on housing, Bothell is actually in the highest category in that context. So we pay about 33% of our income towards housing. If you look at HUD, designated unaffordable housing and transport, we're also pretty bad. We fall into about 56% on that metric. So we're in I think the second highest category in that situation. Also notable about our specific reason is the way that we use land. So there's value to having mixed use land, which means that you have commercial mixed with residential, that you have farms mixed with residential, that you have this diversity. We're sort of notable, and you won't be shocked at all to see that we have very poor mixed land use because we are primarily subdivisions in this area. So overall, what is the message of this when we're thinking about social justice and disparities? Our specific community where we live is extraordinarily privileged in the context of our region. When you look at ranking out of 11, we tend to fall in the top 3 for income, unemployment, poverty, single-parent homes, and people with bachelor's degrees or more.
So in our area, though, you mean Bothell, not some guy.
Yeah, I'm talking about data. Our region, so this is they break it up into 11 areas, which you saw in that first chart in terms of the regions that they're looking at. So all this publicly accessible data, if you're interested in it, you can just go to the Snohomish Health District and look at that. That's what our context is. That's what we're surrounded by, and it brings the idea of social justice and what disparities we're facing, and what we may or may not see in our immediate surroundings. All right, So I'm going to talk a little bit more about transitioning from this idea of social justice to some of the ideas around what we do in this context. So probably, seeing some of the information I've provided you, both in terms of immigrant labor, in terms of these tremendous disparities that we see in our regions, that is inspiring the type of anger that has led to a lot of the activism that we've seen over generations, right? And this activism is where a lot of the gains that we've had in terms of social justice comes from. Now, there's different ways in which these types of social justice efforts have been expressed historically. There's a term called identity politics, which is one of the major ways that this has occurred historically in terms of activism. And the term for identity politics essentially means that people gather around a specific identity, be that race, be that being gay or lesbian or queer, or being women, thinking about marginalized groups, forming an identity. And some of the real value and virtue of this historically has been that it allows for consciousness raising, right? So, for example, historically, when it comes to feminism, in the 70s, gathering women together actually led to some really important realizations. When you gather women together, having that discussion and recognizing all the different ways in which that oppression exists was tremendously powerful in terms of creating solidarity and creating this movement to address those inequities. By doing this and by creating these groups around these identities, it actually creates blocks of power. And those blocks of power were tremendously, in the civil rights movement and other efforts, have been very effective in actually addressing and raising awareness about these problems that are faced by these different groups that are marginalized. Now, identity politics, politics generally are prone to strife, right? This is part of the deal, right? But in the experience of those different movements, there has been increasingly raised over years, and still were issues at that time, around challenges to that structure and challenges to that way of thinking and doing things. So there's a few characteristics of identity politics that have been criticized that I want you to be aware of. Now, I'll start off with a caveat, which is saying that this is not universally true. In any of those identity politics movements I just mentioned, there are a lot of people who took much more complex views of these things. However, these are sort of general criticisms that have been made of identity politics sort of approaches. The first one that I want to mention is the assumption of binary. So binary is male-female, binary is black-white, or other groups, gay or not gay, things like that. And what that does is it sort of moves away from the idea that identities, people can have multiple identities. So you can be gay and black and a woman, right? So you can have multiple things that affect who you are as a person, right? You can also, within those identities, sometimes they're not black or white. You can be on a transition between male and female. You can be somewhere between gay and straight. There are these flexibilities in terms of how people view and experience their own lives. The other thing that it assumes is that people are an identity. They are a thing. They are male. They are female. Those are things that they are, rather than it's something that they perform an identity in context. And this is a key sort of distinction that's pretty important for understanding this criticism, in the sense that there is a movement towards thinking about identities being something that you act. It's something you do. And the way of illustrating this is that the way that I might perform masculinity is going to look different when I'm a child than when I'm a teenager, than when I'm in college, than when I'm a father, if I were a father, than if I was an old man. These are things that actually change in terms of the actions, behaviors, assumptions that happen according to those things. And there are societal roles where you actually perform that gender or other things like that. So instead of having it viewed as a fixed identity, it's viewing it as something that we actually flex within. And it's something that we can perform in different ways. And that trying to fix an identity is actually a form of oppression, to make people be a certain thing. Right? There's another concern about identity politics, which is that sometimes it can, in focusing on one type of issue, it can ignore certain underlying causes. So instead of by looking at, say, racism, you might not be paying attention to things like capitalism, which underlie racism, but also underlie sexism, and also underlie other things like that. So there are ways in which perhaps by narrowing that focus, you can not pay attention to other issues. Then we also have the concern about assimilationist agendas. So I can speak about this particularly in terms of sexual orientation. So there's a big movement in the LGBT community to be seen as being normal, right? And that means moving towards gay marriage, for example, right? So we're just like everybody else. We should marry like other people, and we should look like other people. Well, that's works for some people because a lot of those identities associate. That's an easier thing very often for people who are already privileged within those identity groups. All right. So being that normal, being being able to assimilate is something that's much easier for a white gay man to do than a trans black woman, for example, right? So there are differences when these assimilation agendas exist. And this connects to the next idea, which is that typically in these identity groups, it's very often the case that the most privileged in those groups tend to set the agendas, right? So this is, for example, a big criticism of feminism. So feminism, there is a huge schism between black feminism and white feminist sort of thought. And that has caused tremendous strife, and for good reason. Because very early on, a lot of the focus, so if you take a group of people centered around the idea of feminism, the probability is on average, they are, just by demographic factors, they're probably more of them are going to be white, right? And if you just take the average of that, the average needs of that, it's going to be a white agenda, right? Because they just outnumber other groups, right? So there's also the case that within a certain category, people who are most privileged tend to have the most luck in terms of pushing their agendas.
And just an example of that would be like within feminism is when we look at the wage gap,
right.
And the figure is like 76 to a dollar, 76 cents to a dollar. That's the figure for white women. But when you look at black women and Hispanic women, it gets even lower.
Right.
And so that's a prime example of the privileged in that group setting the norm, I guess. For them.
Yeah. Another example might be, for example, what do we prioritize in terms of what we look at? Are we looking at, we know that corporate pay and access to corporate roles is very different for women. You know, women are tremendously underrepresented among those groups. So maybe our priority is to actually improve corporate structures so that women have more access to these roles as CEOs, for example. Whereas for many black feminists, their argument was, that's not even on the table for us. You know, that's not what I want to prioritize. I want to prioritize having food on the table and increasing the minimum wage, right? So those two things are different views of trying to change that motion, and you'll have a difference between white and black feminism in that tradition. So these are very contentious sort of challenges. And you'll see these types of challenges pop up not across any sort of identity politics type situation. The other thing is that what can happen in these situations is the privileged groups within these identity politics can achieve their goals at the cost of other marginalized groups. So we see that in the queer community. Very often there's been a lot of concern that there has been prioritization of gay marriage, for example, over trans rights, right? That, you know, for a very long time, the gay agenda became to be, we're going to put all the money into gay marriage, right? As opposed to addressing concerns for trans communities. And trans communities got really marginalized within that overall group, right? Even though, you know, that they're a major part of that community, right? So sometimes you can do that at the cost and sometimes even at the harm of other communities. And you also see that between politics, between trying to push for race versus, say, feminism. So that becomes really hard if you're, you know, so if you're in a identity politics community, you know, historically, for example, during the civil rights movement, a lot of black women were one of the major backbones of that movement. But there's also a situation of sexual assaults in those communities, and also and violence against women. So very often, Anita Hill is an example of this type of situation where they were told, those women were told by the community that they have to keep quiet about this problem so that they don't make black men look bad, right? So there's ways in which you can actually be marginalized, you can be hurt by the asserting privilege of certain members of a community, right? So this is something that's sort of a problem with using these identity groups as a political framework for action. So this really led to the idea of intersectionality and kyriarchy, which I'm going to go into as sort of a way that I think if we're thinking about current politics and current political action, this is sort of essentially where especially younger communities tend to try and push their politics. We're not great at it yet. Nobody's really great at this sort of way of doing things, but we're trying to do better at it. So what I will note before I go into this is that I'm going to be talking about theory. All right. The truth is, I just want to note this because what I'm talking about here is serious and it's very emotional, right? When we're talking about privilege, when we're talking about oppression, very intimate, it's very emotional. I am talking about it at an abstract level, and I'm not really going into the emotion of that. Right? I'm doing that for a reason. One is I think it's actually helpful to have an intellectual framework before we go into some of those conversations. I'm hoping that in our future conversations in the series, we'll go into that more. This might not be the time for that. Here, what I'm trying to offer is just a way to sort of benchmark and sort of think about these structures, all right? So I'm not trying to marginalize those other ways of thinking about this. I'm just sort of postponing those conversations. All right, so intersectionality, what is intersectionality? Intersectionality is an idea that has been around for actually a very long time, but this term and the modern articulation of it was done by Kimberly Crenshaw, was an African-American feminist writer who in 1989 talked about the idea that components of marginalization are not independent, but they are interwoven, that you can't distinguish these different identities. And her discussion was primarily around being black and being a feminist, right? And how do you, and I think maybe also being queer. So how do you disentangle them? Well, you can't, right? These are things that people live as complex beings with many complex components to themselves. And that we, to really address this, we have to recognize that complexity in terms of identities and not ignore or make subservient some components of ourselves to meet the needs of a specific identity, right? You can't subserviate your complete self to an identity. Another idea that came with this is the idea of kyriarchy, created by Elizabeth Fiorenza. And this essentially, the definition of this essentially leadership by a master, right? So it's lordship over, right? And here is sort of like essentially taking the idea of patriarchy and expanding it. It's saying that patriarchy is an idea of identity politics, kyriarchy is an idea of intersectionality, that there is something to fight against. There is something there that is a thing to oppose in our social structures, but that trying to view it in a more complex way. And this is just helpful in that intersectionality is a process. This is a thing that you can oppose, that you can resist. You can oppose the kyriarchy. Yeah.
In my ignorance, I'm still a little vague about what intersectionality means.
Sure. Can I actually show you the next slide?
Are you kidding me?
I think I'll get there. I think a lot of what I'm talking about, I'll be using kyriarchy as a framework, but it's essentially the same general idea that identities are intermeshed.
Okay.
All right. So here's essentially what they created in terms of the framework for kyriarchy. This is an adaptation of what I think Fiorina created. And what it's looking at here is a system for viewing complex identities. All right. So essentially it views the many different identities that people have in this spectrum across different types of axes. All right. So here, down the center, is the line of what we call domination. So we see a flow of power from the dominant to the marginalized groups in this particular vision. All right, so along top we have genderism, which is viewed being male and masculine and female and feminine versus gender deviant in quotation marks, being male, being white, being of European heritage, being heterosexual, being able-bodied, being credentialed, being young, being attractive, being upper and middle class, being anglophone in terms of language bias, being light or pale in terms of colorism, being Gentile or non-Jew in terms of anti-Semitism, being fertile in terms of pronatalism. And the idea here is that there are many different ways in which we can categorize or understand flows of power in a society. And each of us can recognize that we each carry different components of privilege versus oppression in ourselves along all of these different axes. So here we have people who have relative power and privilege, and people who are generally fall into being oppressed in that power dynamic. Now there's some benefits to looking at things this way. So one is that it explains complexity, and it sort of also acknowledges invisible oppression, right? So something that's very common in terms of the ways that conversations get off track is that you sometimes have situations where, for example, you might be talking in a group and you might be talking to, say, for example, a white man and say, well, you're so privileged. But what you might not know is he might have been born poor, he might have no money, and he might be just barely scraping by, right? And for that white man, if you start talking about how privileged he is, he's going to get really mad and feel misunderstood, right? That is a way in which very often in identity politics type situations, we create division between people who potentially could have solidarity in terms of opposing institutional oppression, right? So this complexity and recognizing this complexity in the people that we're interacting with has power in terms of creating recognition of complexity. And in doing so, it creates this sort of gestalt picture of the fact that we are complex beings with many different components to us. The other thing I note about this is that this is not inherently political. How these relationships, power dynamics arraign is how you define them and how you understand them. So, other political perspectives might say, well, actually, this is flipped. It's wrong, right? You can still use the same diagram of intersectionality. You can still use the same idea around, complex identities and still explain, a different perspective on this. So how you view this is going to vary, right? So I'm by suggesting that we think about things this way, I'm not necessarily imposing my politics on you. That is a conversation that can be had. Now, I generally believe, how this is laid out here, but I'm just saying that this is hopefully something that could be a conversation across political perspectives. And it's also useful because it can be helpful in terms of recognizing your role. You probably fall somewhere across these different spectrums, and it's helpful to sort of see, okay, where generally do we fall? And I'll talk about that a little bit more later. One thing to note about this is that when we think about this type of system, it's best describing systems, not individuals. What that means is that this is talking about systemic power and systemic oppression. You can't say, by looking at any axes, you can't say a lot about a person. Like, there's ways in which the identity I gave earlier about assuming that a white man has power, they do by the axes of being white, but they may not have power in other situations. So the idea that we can take and consistently apply things to people in a very simplistic way is not very effective. But we can look at this as a very helpful framework for thinking about the ways in which power is unequally distributed in our society, and also the ways in which there are actually very distinct social systems put into place that maintain that power dynamic. Yeah.
So one thing missing here, maybe it's covered in the later slide, is the visibility of the power imbalance.
Yeah.
Speaking as a white, tall male,
right.
I don't see day to day getting privilege.
Right.
I'll see it once in a while and start suspecting it, right? But it creates this whole group of people that might be privileged, not seeing the privilege. Does that make sense?
Right. It's very typical. It's typical that people who fall into
correct, but if you're getting privilege against, if someone else is getting privilege, you see that.
Right. Yeah. It's you know, there's sort of a whole range of theory around the experience of being marginalized, in that you have to think about yourself and about the person that you're sort of being compared to. Whereas people, when you're privileged, very often is invisible in your experience. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that each person that's true for, you know, how you exist in this, how you interact with each of these axes is going to be very you know, dependent on the person. You can have someone who's white, who's an incredibly powerful and vehement activist around racism, right? You can, what you do and who you are as a person is not necessarily explained by where you fall along this. But as a white person, even if you're doing something about it, you still do have that privilege typically. Yeah.
And I think that's why it's, you know, the margin, you're on the margin. Margin is relative to the center. So if you're centered, it's sort of like, you know, you're on stage, you're in the spotlight. You can't see the crowd when you're on the stage, right? Everybody can see you. If you're in the audience, you can see the people on the stage, you can see the people in the rows in front of you, next to you, but the people on stage can't see very well.
Right.
And they can only see who else is on there, in there with them. And so I think that's like a huge problem with privilege, or with, you know, the more of those axes you're on, the more centered you are, your identities are, then the harder it is for you to understand that there's a lot of other things going on around you to other people.
And we see that in terms of how we gather information. So if you look at research, there's abundant research on the experience of being marginalized, on being black, on having all these different things. The field of white studies, you may not have heard of that. It does exist. But like, we tend not to even bother to study or notice the people who are in power, because it's just assumed to be normal. The people in power are able to define the normal, right? And therefore it's not seen as being worth study. But when you take a queer theory perspective on things, the people who are in power are actually just as interesting as people who aren't in power, marginalized. And we can study what it means to be white just as much as we can study what it means to be black, for example. Not necessarily to always use that analogy, but
Chris?
Yeah.
One thing that it has, strikes me that's on the marginalized persons with disabilities, speaking of invisibility, is that often when we think of disability, we think of physical disability. We don't include mental health disability.
Right. So physical, which is very visible, versus mental health, which is an invisible disability, right? And that has real implications for allocation of resources and how we think about things.
I'm assuming there's a number of things here that are shown to fit the idea. For example, neurotypical versus non-neurotypical.
That's a great one. So I'll get to well, we can just skip to that. I'll get to it, but the idea is this is not a complete list of all the different ways that we could study this, nor is it necessarily a simple and accurate list in terms of depicting this. For example, if we look at ageism, young versus old, in this dynamic, well, that actually isn't quite accurate, right? Because it's actually working age versus not working age. Remember, children have almost no power. They have no legal rights in our society, right? So it's actually a U-shaped sort of relationship. So these are crude sort of like estimates of power in society, and that just speaks to the complexity of it. And you know, you could take any consideration of choice that you're interested in and put it on the same chart and fill this out. So the other thing is that all these axes in the system is actually culturally specific, right? So what this looks like in terms of being of European heritage, well, maybe in other countries that may or may not be to your advantage, depending on the political situation in those countries, right? What is viewed as being attractive in one society is very different in other societies, right? So the ways that this is expressed is a culturally specific process. It's also incomplete, as I mentioned. For example, you could look at things like industrial nations versus non-industrial nations, right? That's probably one of the most important axes in terms of looking at this in terms of privilege. The other thing I would just note, again, getting to the idea that this is worth considering across political perspective, is that this is actually something that's subject to empirical evidence. Like the way that this power flows is something that we could make arguments about. So if you look at men's rights advocates, they would say that the men are the ones who are disadvantaged and women are the ones who are advantaged in our current society. The feminism have gone wild, right? And you know, I would then point them to a lot of data which suggests that that is not true. But that can be an empirical conversation around how is this happening? What are these dynamics? Yeah.
Seems like a lot of that conversation is around, it's kind of misconstruing this around the personal versus the systemic and cultural kind of lens. So it's like looking at, well, I feel disadvantaged in
Yeah.
and maybe that person is disadvantaged, but as you're saying, the empirical evidence, looking at the systemic systems that support and the culture that supports it are kind of different from and having the conversation kind of separating out from the personal to the systemic, it often seems like a really helpful cross to bridge some of that dialogue.
Yeah.
I'm also thinking that people with different cultural backgrounds may be feeling to move to off the low part by moving into communities where there's more predominance there. Because, I mean, if I go into a black neighborhood that's all black and I'm the only white person, I don't feel particularly privileged there.
Okay.
Because I'm in a minority. And for instance, when I almost had Jewish in-laws, when I was in their presence, I felt like I had no power at all because I didn't have the cultural background.
I'll actually address that. So that situation actually doesn't change necessarily the direction of this, but it does speak to the fact that this is situational.
Yes.
What I just want to do is do some sort of like clarifications of some of these things. This chart is not great at depicting a few different things that are what you described there. So one of them is the idea that impact varies depending on these different axes. So we know that tall people actually have a range of different social privileges compared to people who are short. And by the picture I just showed, these would be axes of equal length. But when we look across different types of axes and different types of privileges and oppressions, they have different power, right? So sure, I'm tall and I'm relatively high income, right? But the income can dominate that sort of relationship, right? If I was short and high income, I could still have a tremendous amount of power and privilege, right? Even though, by this view, maybe the being short would balance that out, right? So there's a way in which you could view this as a weighted sort of system so that, we know that income has a huge impact and other things may not have as big of an impact. For example, whether you're Jewish or not may not be as relevant to this as whether you're high income or not, for example. The other point that I want to make here is that power actually goes in two directions, all right? It is not the case when we look at these flows of power across privilege and oppression that people who are oppressed do not have any power. That's not what this is saying, all right? It is true that, it would be totally dismissive and disrespectful to say that women don't have power, right, in that system. That is not the case. What it's saying is that on average, that there is this flow of power from one to another, and you can demonstrate that using empirical evidence around income, around a range of different things. That on average there is ways in which we live in a male-dominated society, right? But it's also important, getting to the point that you made earlier, is that there are circumstances in which women will hold power that men do not. So I'll just give an example here that I hope is kind of accurate. So when it comes to experience of parenthood, right, very often because women are often associated with parenthood, very often people go to women as being sort of authorities in this domain. Do you agree with me? Yeah. So this is a situation where by your identity, you might have certain power in a certain conversation, in a certain context, that doesn't change the overall dynamic of that flow of power, right? So this is a complex complex relationship.
Yeah, it was just touching back kind of on the conversation just a bit ago, what Brian was saying about situational versus like the empirical, and like in situations, kind of what Hyra was speaking to as well, that when in men's rights, people who are used to being in power, when they are called in or like their power is pointed out, can often feel that they are then being oppressed. When in actuality, it's the system that they're working within that is dominant and oppressing others. So that's just, I just wanted to note that can usually be a response to people with power that are being called into their experience of power over others. So like you're saying situational and also like if you feel oppressed in some way, like there's like take a second look potentially and see that it might be because you're suddenly feeling like you're losing power. And you're not really being oppressed.
Yeah, like the rise of white supremacy right now is, a perfect example of that in terms of, now, that's again comes to the complexity that, poor white people are the majority of poor people in the United States. There are a lot of poor white people, but it doesn't take away the fact that by being white you do have privileges that come along with that. All right, so the other thing that I want to just note here is that the way that, when getting back to the idea that privileges and these dynamics of power interact, they are not independent. They actually have an enmeshing. We view them as an individual line, but they have a relationship between them, all right? So if we look at, for example, here being white versus being a person of color and being cisgender versus being transgender, right? I just attached numbers to let's just assume that there was numbers of magnitude of oppression. This is just purely academic, all right? So let's say that being transgender puts you at an 8 and being a person of color puts you at 6. You can switch that or whatever happens to be. Now, the point that I'm trying to make here is that we don't really know. It's not that you necessarily add up all the different things and you come up with 6 plus 8 equals 14, and my oppression level is 14. There's actually ways in which lack of privilege actually may interact in much more complex ways. So that being transgender or being a person of color may actually be multiplicative, right? So it might be 6 times 8 that you're actually producing something that by having multiple oppressions, you might actually have a much bigger impact. And actually, this is empirically shown. This is not just purely hypothetical, that you can actually show that when you have multiple oppressions, that it doesn't just go up in an additive way, it can actually go up in a multiplicative way. But the truth is we usually don't know. It actually isn't really possible to take those pieces apart usually and sort of really say for an individual person in an individual context exactly how these identities interact. And that really necessitates a certain amount of intellectual modesty on our parts, right? That means that we have to recognize that we don't entirely understand these systems, right? And how that power interacts in these complex ways. There is a major challenge that comes up in these types of conversations. And this gets back to the identity politics type of conversations around, there's a term which is called oppression Olympics, which is there is a real risk in dealing with identity politics and these types of axes of power of sort of trying to go back to, remember, the tall versus short versus income or high income or low income, saying, trying to promote the idea that because I'm short, this is really, really important, more important than income or something like that, where you're trying to get your piece of the pie in terms of respect. And that's understandable because when you identify with something and when you've had disadvantages and marginalization, of course you want that to be recognized and respected. But when you have this oppression Olympics as a sort of framework for doing things, you don't create a situation of solidarity. You create a zero-sum game where you try and have battles between different communities to try and argue for different oppressions. And then you have marginalized people fighting one another to try and get what they can. And that is not necessarily a way to successfully move forward on dealing with these systematic oppressions and the hierarchy.
Yeah, that is a common method for racist groups, using racist groups by oppressive groups to maintain the position of power. Divide and conquer.
Right. Yeah. And you give a little to one person, you give to a little to another person, and you can you can triangulate to sort of maintain that power structure, right? Which is a very powerful structure that's hard to separate, right? To disrupt. There's an idea of checking your privilege, and this is an uncomfortable one, but you can actually use this idea, this intersectional framework, as a way of thinking about yourself. So this is my crude attempt at charting out me on this sort of thing. Well, the truth is look at my sort of breakdown of this, and any of you could take this same structure and sort of piece out where you stand on this sort of framework. You know what? I can't look at this and not think, well, you know what, Chris, you're doing pretty good. in terms of privilege, right? You can take it and you can sort of say, the further out, the more weight you get it. And we also are recognizing that things like being higher income probably is actually an axis that is this long, and having higher income probably has even more weight in terms of tipping it. You can almost think of it as a plate that balances on a pivot. And like each of these dots represents weights that sort of push it in one direction or another, right? That's actually why I kind of like the visual, yeah.
But some of these things relate in a way that the reason you might be higher income, you don't necessarily see it, is because of your race, because of your gender, because of your age, because of your cultural background.
Right. So again, the idea that these interact, they support and reinforce one another. They come as packages in many ways. But everybody has their own complex mixture in them as well, right? So when we think about this in a personal way, again, I think that this system is better for understanding this approach. Curiosity is better for understanding systems than understanding individuals. But it's important to recognize that as we are sort of challenging ourselves to see our privilege or oppression society, remember that we are cognitively biased in terms of how we view that. We have, generally speaking cognitively, is we tend to, when we look at our successes, we tend to overemphasize our own personal traits. For example, I have a PhD. That's because I worked really hard, right? I overemphasize the amount of effort and time that I put into this, and I tend to underemphasize, fail to recognize these external situations like my privilege that gave me a PhD, right? So that's it's called attribution bias. You can read about it. But there's another one, is when we're looking at other people, we tend to overemphasize, with successes, we tend to overemphasize external situations. So other people get benefits because of things that were given to them because they have more money or whatever it happens to be, and tend to not recognize their personal characteristics. So if someone bumps you with their car, you tend to focus on they're an asshole instead of, maybe there were situations where I had to get to work and they'd be fired if they didn't, right? So there's inherent biases to how we even measure our own privilege in these contexts. Now, there's a tendency, and this is really important when we think about privilege, there's a tendency to align privilege with guilt, right? And that's really understandable, right? It's really hard to recognize the fact that the things that you've gotten, who you are, is partially produced. Privilege is sort of an unequal distribution. So what you've gotten is something that didn't go to somebody else and often didn't go to that other person unfairly, right? So that's a hard thing to handle. It's a hard thing to deal. But something I'll also note is that privilege is also an opportunity, right? It is an opportunity in the sense that when you have more privilege, there's ways in which you actually have more power to disrupt this overall system in many ways. So people who are marginalized, they have to deal with their marginalization, and also having to be activists to change the system on top of that is another sort of thing that makes life even harder, right? Whereas I, as a white male, in white male spaces or privileged spaces, if I commit myself to disrupting that systems, the way things are talked about, or ways women are viewed, or things like that, I actually have inordinate power to disrupt these systems of power imbalances. So there's ways in which, instead of viewing it as a topic for guilt, there's ways to view it as actually you've been given this tremendous opportunity to make such a difference for so many people.
Well, isn't it also that you get to do it from a position with much less personal risk?
Yes.
That privilege. I'm not saying you, but I'm saying that in that situation, that what's at risk for you to be disruptive,
right,
is very different than what's at risk for the person that starts out with less. It's like your underpinnings or your safety net.
Yeah.
Because the privilege is really a safety net.
Right. And also, there's also a way in which, because you're not doing on your own benefit, people see people who do things for their own benefit as being selfish or something like that. When you're doing something, you can be seen as being more saying, this is a problem. We have inequity. So sometimes that can give you certain types of power as well in that conversation. Now, that power is something you have to be careful with, of course, right? Because when you're speaking on other people's behalf, there's sometimes problems for you actually understanding their experience, right? So when we think about privilege and understanding privilege, remember privilege is the other side of oppression. And we need to understand, we need to not divorce that privilege from oppression. We tend to focus on oppression and not pay any attention to privilege, right? Again, because privilege tends to be invisible to us. We just see it as being the norm, right? The other thing is that privileges and oppressions affect each other, but they don't negate each other, all right? So it isn't the fact that if I'm white and gay, that suddenly being white means that I don't have the disadvantages of being gay, for example, right? You still have those different characteristics, and they still interact to influence your social standing, right? So you don't sort of balance, you don't actually subtract from one another. They're always something that you have to pay attention to.
And the reverse as well. Being gay doesn't mean you can't be racist or have problems with your being white.
Yeah, totally, right? So these are complex relationships, and that you have to pay attention to how they interact, right? The other thing about privilege is that privilege isn't necessarily it's not necessarily a bad thing. In some senses, privilege is what everybody should get, right? We're experiencing what people should get absent, oppression, right? So we can view this as a benchmark for what we should be thinking about in terms of distribution. So why isn't that the fact that everybody doesn't have those privileges? That should be the benchmark that we're working up to. And the final thing is, again, privilege doesn't mean that you didn't work hard, right? It doesn't mean that you didn't put in effort. It just means that, you had a certain advantage in some ways, right? And that you didn't have to push through disadvantages that other people. An example here is like in a bike race, if you have, you might have a really good bike, right, that allowed you to go. It doesn't mean that you didn't, on your really good bike, it doesn't mean that you didn't bike your bike as fast as you could as compared to somebody with a flat tire, right? But you're still going to go a lot faster, and you're going to have a lot of privileges as a result.
You have 5 or 6 bicycles you're biking that block each other's wind.
Right. Yeah.
And that gives you a competitive edge.
Yeah.
Which is one of the things that come up. It's maybe just me, but I was taught as a kid to be extremely competitive.
Yeah.
To take every advantage I could get. And there's a like a little devil on my shoulder saying, hey, you got this advantage, take it. You got this advantage, take it.
Yeah.
And also a sense of zero-sum overall gain. Hey, if I lose my privilege, someone else.
Mm-hmm.
Right? If I give someone else privilege, I lose mine. There's a mentality there that I don't know where it comes from, but I see it.
Yeah.
I certainly see it growing up.
Yeah.
It's insidious.
It's kind of connected to our community idea of the scarcity model versus the abundance model, right? Can we view this as like helping other people actually helps build abundance for everybody? And that's a hard transition because that's not how we function as a society. So I'm almost done here, but what I would just say is that there are some basic truths to recognize as we go forward with these conversations around social justice, around privilege and oppression, and some are, when you look at these complex relationships, the truth is that everybody here, we are all have been targeted by oppression in some way or another at some point in our lives. Even when you're a child, like children are oppressed by the system. Like we all know in some way what oppression looks like.
They're unionizing though, I've heard.
Oh yeah, nice.
Yeah.
There's also ways in which we are all privileged, right? So everybody has an element of that and can connect into that idea. The other thing is that we need to recognize and acknowledge that we've all participated in supporting systems of oppression. It's impossible to get away from that in the world that we live in. These are systems that are incredibly robust. They've been built over generations. It's not possible to live in the world that we live in and not have participated in those systems of oppression. Now, the more that we can see that and interact with that, that's the better off we are. But that's something that we need to recognize, that we are not independent of those systems that we're working in. There's also a way in which oppression damages us all, right? It doesn't matter whether you're targeted by it or privileged, right? The idea that, if you're talking about being, gender binary, for example, having to be a certain form of masculinity is actually really painful, right? Even if you're in the privileged class, right? So there's ways in which being gifted that privilege has negatives that come along with that, right? So I'm not saying that they're equal to being marginalized, but I am saying that there's ways in which oppression is hurting or harmful to everyone, right? And getting back to the idea of, more egalitarian societies have benefits for everybody. The other thing I want to note is just the idea between the difference between guilt and responsibility. That this is a problem that we have as a society, and there is a way in which we can sort of dive into that guilt, right? And that can prevent us from actually doing anything. And there's ways in which guilt is actually kind of a cop-out, right? An emotional cop-out. And there's ways in which there's a difference in terms of who we are and how we can exist that focuses in on responsibility around from an ethical standpoint. There's also a difference between intent and impact, right? So we can do lots of things I can do lots of things as a privileged person, right? That where I'm intending to do good things, right? But they might actually have negative impacts, right? So if I were to take on, for example, I might take on an issue around feminism, right? And I might get it totally wrong. I might be trying to do something, but I actually reinforce the binary or do something that actually harms women, right? Now, it's important to note that, maybe I did try and do something good, but the impact is probably more important than my intent. We can respect the intent, but we need to be able to distinguish our intent about being good people from the fact that we may have actually harmed others in what we're doing. And getting back to the idea of identity politics and the way of parsing things out, a lot of what we do in terms of pushing for our own needs in that scarcity model actually cause others to suffer. And we need to acknowledge and recognize the complex relationships around how we impact others in terms of what we do, even if we're trying to do it for positive goals. And the other thing just to note here is that oppression lives in our bodies, right? It affects who we are, it's embodied, it affects our stress, it affects how we think. And we need to respect that among ourselves and others, and to nurture each other in recognizing this. And I think that that's a helpful thing for recognizing the impacts that we get from these types of situations. So this again was adapted from the Northwest Network, which is a really great queer anti-sexual violence group in the area. So I know I've been sort of like theory focused and sort of talking about these different concepts for how we think about intersectionality and addressing these issues, but there is sort of some hopeful ideas and an underlying message to this. And it really centers around the idea of how can we build the idea of solidarity? How can we look across these different identities, around these different perspectives, and actually build connections and meaningful ties across groups? Getting back to Katie's idea around being able to work together to actually improve social justice and actually create a mutually beneficial future. How can we do that well, and how can we prepare ourselves and think about this so that we're good at doing that? And that requires a lot of personal work, and it requires a lot of community work as well. So I think that when we're thinking about the Liberation Permaculture series, I hope that it's a way that we can continue talking about that. I think that we have a lot of interesting things to think about as a community. And my hope is that we can work together to sort of find some voice around chipping away at some of those challenges that we see in the bigger picture in our local communities and in the way that we make our decisions. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.